This video is about the secular events that prove Jesus in the New Testament. Specifically, Titus sacks Jerusalem and destroys the temple in 70 AD. It's a fact that critics often assert that there are no secular historical events that prove Jesus outside the narratives of the New Testament. I've compiled over 130 of these events here on my website that you can peruse for yourself. And one of these events that is among the most stunning is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Romans in 70 AD. An often ignored artifact of the New Testament are the genealogies of Jesus that are really validated by secular history. It's a fact of the historical record that the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple in 70 AD. This fact confirms that Matthew and Luke's Gospels in the New Testament must have been written before 70 AD. Both Gospels include a detailed genealogy for Jesus. Now, concerning the two genealogies of Jesus, when Titus came into Jerusalem and destroyed the city, the Roman soldiers burned the temple to the ground. And all of the genealogies and all of the records which recorded the line of descendants for every Jew were also destroyed at that time. According to Hebrew prophecy, the Messiah must be descended from David and Abraham. And since there were no records after 70 AD, after the destruction of the temple, there was no one that could prove that they were really qualified to be the Messiah. In order for Matthew and Luke to see these records and place them into Jesus' genealogy in their Gospels, the temple must have been standing and all the genealogical records were still intact. It was extremely important that Jesus be able to prove he was descended from both David and Abraham, or he could not be certified as the Messiah. The destruction of the temple in 70 AD and all the records of Jewish genealogies made it impossible for any future Jew to demonstrate that they were the true Messiah. This was sort of the Lord's way of making it clear to the world that his Messiah had already come and no others need apply. A secondary fact of the 70 AD destruction of Israel and the temple that really validates the New Testament is the witness of early writing. In 32 AD, Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and said that not one stone of the temple would be left upon another. In Luke 21, verses 20 through 24, he said, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its destruction is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. There will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles, until the time of the Gentiles," Jesus said, "are fulfilled." In Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2, Jesus went in and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, "Do you not see these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." It's interesting that Jewish historian Flavius Josephus recorded that just 38 years after Jesus spoke these words to the Roman general Titus, he sacked Jerusalem and obliterated the temple. These were the most important events of that first century for the Jewish nation. Yet they are absent from the entire New Testament. The only possibility that this could occur is if the writers of the four Gospels and the letters of Paul, Peter, James, and Jude would not have been written about these crucial events, is if the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple had not yet taken place before the Gospels were written. The fact that these two critical events in the history of the Jews were never mentioned in the New Testament is empirical evidence that the New Testament was written before 70 AD. If the books of the New Testament were written after 70 AD, it's certain that the writers would have been eager to demonstrate that Jesus' prophecy was fulfilled in their Gospels. Paul would have also indicated that these prophecies were fulfilled in these 13 letters that he wrote. When Jesus predicted Peter's betrayal, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all record the fulfillment of this prophecy. And this is because this event happened before the writing of these three Gospels. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple were not included in the New Testament because they had not yet taken place. These facts prove that the New Testament letters, including the four Gospels, but not including perhaps Revelation, were all written before 70 AD when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. In my book, These Things Were Written, an expositional treatise of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, I document 14 prophecies that Jesus spoke while here on earth, and concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, Jesus predicted this event just before he was crucified and resurrected. In prophecies 12 through 14 in my book, they are included here in this study, this video today, in corroboration of the secular events of Roman history that prove Jesus is a genuine person from history, crucified and risen from the dead. In prediction 12, Jesus predicts the encirclement of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. These events would not happen within one generation, he said, of those who heard this prophecy. In Matthew 24:34, for days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children with you, and they will not leave one stone upon another, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Jesus said, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until these things take place. The context of Jesus' revelation of Jerusalem's destruction to the disciples in Luke 19:29, verses 21 through 24, is spoken directly after Palm Sunday, 32 AD. Jesus is describing the judgment that will come upon Israel for her rejection of him as the Messiah. The fulfillment of this prophecy occurred within one 40-year generation. In 70 AD, Titus brought his army against Jerusalem, sacked the city, and destroyed the temple, burning it to the ground. And literally, as Jesus said, not one stone was left upon another. In Matthew chapter 24, this is essentially the same account that Luke records as Jesus is seen in the temple with the disciples when he tells them the same thing, not one stone will be left upon another. This occurred during Titus, his siege of Jerusalem. It's exactly what Jesus had predicted in these two Gospels. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to show him the buildings of the temple. And he said to them, do you see these things? Not one stone here will be left upon another that will not be thrown down. And then again in prediction 13 in my book, during the taking of Jerusalem, the Jews will be scattered over the face of the earth. In Luke 21, verse 24, Jesus said, and they, speaking of those in Jerusalem and Judea, in verses 20 and 21, will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Again, the Jewish historian Josephus describes the destruction of Jerusalem and the murder of 1.1 million Jews, as well as another 97,000 Jews who were taken as captives of war. Thousands of other citizens of Jerusalem were sold as slaves, with many more being dispersed all over the world. This entire event is recorded by Josephus in his book, The Book of the Wars, book 5, chapter 22, sections 1 through 3. Now, as a sort of sidebar to all this, the recording of events from 70 AD by a non-biblical source by Jewish historian Flavius Josephus is a substantial source of authentication for the New Testament accounts concerning the predictions of Jesus. Jesus, you remember, he warned his disciples ahead of time to flee Jerusalem before the siege began in 66 AD. He told them to watch for this sign in Luke 21, verses 20 through 24. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its destruction is near. Then let those in Judea flee to the mountains, let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, Jesus said, that all things which are written may be fulfilled, and there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon these people, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles once again until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. Now, the first siege of Jerusalem began in 66 AD, according to Flavius Josephus, as he writes that the entire difficulty began at Caesarea in 66 BC, when local Greek citizens set about offering birds as sacrifices in front of a local synagogue. And though the Jewish authorities protested vehemently, the Roman army garrison located nearby did nothing to stop the Greeks. One of the clerks from the Jewish temple, Eleazar ben Hananiah, ordered the cessation of normal prayers and sacrifices that had been conducted for the Roman emperor at the Jewish temple. In response, the Romans dispatched troops under order from the Roman governor, Gessius Florus, to seize 17 talents of gold from the temple, the treasury of the Jews, claiming that the gold was for the emperor. As the local population of Jews learned of the stolen gold from their beloved temple treasury, in an effort to ridicule the Roman governor in this alleged poverty, the people began to pass around a woven basket to take up a collection for Gessius Florus. This opened up contempt for his authority and caused Florus to dispatch soldiers to Jerusalem on the following day to arrest many of the leaders of the Jews in Jerusalem. Now, several men were scourged and crucified on that day, according to the accounts written by Josephus. This atrocity against the Jews resulted in many Jewish soldiers from Judea to launch an attack against the Roman garrison at Jerusalem. An officer of the Roman army, Cestius Gallus, gathered an assembly of troops from the Syrian legion of 12th Fulminata, a total of 30,000 soldiers, to suppress the uprising of the Jews. And when Gallus reached Caesarea and Jaffa, according to Josephus, he murdered, if you can imagine, 8,400 Jews. This conflict between the Jews and the Roman authority continued to escalate until 70 AD, when the entire city of Jerusalem and the temple itself were destroyed. Those who believed Jesus' prophecy escaped, and the Jews who had believed in Jesus as the Messiah evacuated Jerusalem after its first siege in 66 AD, ahead of the final Roman siege that took place in 70 AD. Just as Jesus had predicted, there was a massive slaughter of those who remained in Jerusalem and did not believe the words of his prophecy. The Roman army general Titus, who later became the emperor of the Roman Empire, he came with his second in command, Tiberius Julius Alexander. Titus brought his army to the western side of Jerusalem with 3 legions of soldiers. The strategy of Titus was simple: cut off the food and water, all the supplies to Jerusalem, and starve the people into submission. Many people died of starvation during the siege of Titus, as the food supplies of the Jews inside the city of Jerusalem were depleted. Some people resorted to eating the flesh of their dead in order to survive. And this was the fulfillment of the prophecy of Zechariah 11:9, where the prophet wrote, "Let those that are left at each other eat each other's flesh." During Passover, Titus allowed the pilgrims who came to Jerusalem for worship to enter the city to celebrate Passover. But then he refused to allow them to depart. A few attacks by the Jews of the Roman soldiers killed some of Titus's men. In an insightful move by Titus, he dispatched his men to bring the Jewish historian Josephus back to Jerusalem in order to convince the Jews to surrender peacefully. Instead, the Jews put an arrow into Josephus, viewing him as a traitor for seeking the surrender of Jerusalem to the Romans. In one of the attacks by the Jews, Titus was nearly killed, the history books record. About the middle of May 70 AD, Titus ordered the construction of a siege wall all around the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the newly built third wall with a battering ram. The Antonia fortress of Herod was taken just north of the Temple Mount. As fighting ensued inside Jerusalem, the Jews were forced into the temple as a second attempt at negotiating a ceasefire had failed. One of the Roman soldiers threw a burning spear into the wall of the temple and set it on fire. Titus had not planned to destroy the temple, but we should remember that Jesus had predicted that not one stone would be left upon another when he pronounced judgment on the Jews for their rejection of him as the Messiah. Titus had planned to take the temple and turn it into a Roman temple, dedicated to the Roman emperor. Instead, the fire spread throughout the temple, the building, and it quickly destroyed the entire structure. Now, according to 2 Chronicles 3:8, the gold that lined the entire inner room of the Holy of Holies was about 23 tons. At $1,500 per ounce, this would place the value of the gold inside the holy place at $1,104,000,000. As the fire accelerated into an intense heat, the priests trapped inside the holy place were burned alive. The gold that lined the entire inner room of the holy place melted and ran into the cracks of the foundation stones. In their greed, the Roman soldiers, seeing the melted gold now cooled and laying between the stones of the temple, they pried up one stone upon another until the temple was obliterated. In this way, the literal words of Jesus that not one stone would be left upon another was fulfilled. It's interesting that on Tisha B'Aviv, August 9th of 70 AD, the temple was destroyed and by September 7th, 70 AD, Jerusalem was completely under control of the Romans. In a certain act of divine providence, the first temple was also destroyed by the Babylonians on the exact same day that Titus destroyed the second temple, August 9th of 586 BC. Now, although this prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD by the Roman siege on Jerusalem and burning of the temple, there appears to also be a later fulfillment, as happens many times in Messianic prophecy. There's an earlier and later fulfillment. And so there will be a later fulfillment of this same prophecy. During the midway point of the 7-year tribulation, called the Great Tribulation, the Antichrist will come against Jerusalem to destroy the Jews. And they will also flee the city for what will certainly be the rock city of Petra in Jordan. In Prediction 14 from my book, it describes from the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, the land of Israel will be ruled and overrun by the Gentiles. In Luke 21:24, he writes, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Remember that Jesus had warned the citizens of Israel that their denial of him as their Messiah would cause this very thing to happen. Their land would be desolate. And so Titus, his siege upon Jerusalem, did in fact leave the city in ruins, as Jesus said, and allowed for the fulfillment of Jesus' words in Luke 21:24, trampled by the Gentiles. And so Jesus said, this all happened because you did not know the time of your visitation by the Messiah. Jesus' prediction that Jerusalem would be trampled by the Gentiles was literally fulfilled at the seizing of Jerusalem by Titus. Since 70 A.D., Jerusalem has continually remained under Gentile dominion for almost 2,000 years. Not until 1967 did the Jews once again gain authority over Jerusalem. The complete rulership of all the land that God originally gave Israel will not occur until after the rapture of the church takes place and the end of the 7-year tribulation. The arrival of Jesus to the earth a second time will happen with his church, and it will end the times of the Gentiles specified. Antiquity proves that Jesus is the true prophet of God. We've already seen that the facts of history do not lie. Every event that Jesus described in detail came to pass precisely as he said they would. These 14 prophecies and their fulfillments that I recorded in my book, they leave us with sufficient evidence to conclude that Jesus is a prophet like Moses. In Acts 3:22 through 26, it says, "For Moses truly said to the fathers, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren, and him you shall hear in all things, whatever he says to you. And it shall be that every soul who will not hear that prophet," talking about Jesus, "shall be utterly destroyed from among the people." So these are but a few of the hundreds of impossible circumstances which are presented in my book, These Things Were Written. And they described Jesus in his life, death, and resurrection. This publication is a treatise on the empirical evidence that has been left to us from both the Bible and secular history. The remaining part of this section that I'm going to record later on is devoted to some of the more extraordinary events recorded in the text of the Bible that define the events of Jesus Christ as unparalleled among all events of antiquity. So here you see in this video secular evidence of actual recorded events of history that prove that Jesus exists. He did the things that the eyewitnesses record, and so you can trust all the things that these men recorded in the New Testament.